With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first segment. We're honored to be joined by Dr. Marshall Shepard, Distinguished Professor of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Georgia, and I would note a fellow FSU alum. Dr. Shepard will be in conversation with an icon in Southeast Florida and beyond, John Morales, the Chief Meteorologist with NBC6. Dr. Shepard and Mr. Morales will be further exploring some of the themes that I elevated just now, but will be doing so in a much more eloquent manner than I'm able to muster. So with that, John, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to share the stage with a colleague and a friend, Marshall Shepard. We've, for many years, volunteered together on many efforts. I think we both take pride in science communications, which is so important in this day and age. Oftentimes, in my case, when I'm communicating on TV, about climate change, something which I take pride in doing, or perhaps online, I get a lot of pushback of people telling me to stick to weather. And, Marshall Shepard gets the same pushback as well. If there's ever a time for a scientist not to just stick to weather, this is definitely the time. So, Marshall, let's start off this conversation, about resiliency and all the intersections going on right now between the crises that we're facing and at the same time, of course, accelerating climate change and sea level rise. You are, of course, renowned in many ways, past president of the American Meteorological Society. You've been honored by the White House during the George W. Bush administration for your work. In addition to your role at UGA, you're a regular contributor to Forbes magazine. You're the host of Weather Geeks, which was on TV and now is a podcast. So I think it's fair to say that, few scientists put as much time and effort into communicating to a broad set of audiences as you do, regularly writing on weather and climate change and science and really most recently on the pandemic and the racial uprisings. So talk to us about your experience as a scientist, a meteorologist, a climate change expert, and how these issues intersect with the ongoing crisis that we're facing regarding both the global pandemic and racial injustice in America.
Well, thank you, John, and it's an honor to be here talking to you. I think the last time we were together in person was in Florida, in fact, in Orlando at a big climate event. So, it's an honor to travel in the same circles as you. I'm a big admirer and fan of you and your work. And I want to thank the host and everyone that put this together. I do serve on the ISC National Board now. So when I got an opportunity, I jumped right at it because what you just mentioned, John, is very important. We are dealing with a climate crisis, and I do say climate crisis. It is the challenge of humanity, in not only my opinion, but the opinion of many other scientists and stakeholders and policymakers around the world. At the same time, we're facing an episodic crisis called the coronavirus, COVID-19, and then we have this sustained virus of racism. I confront and deal with all three. I'm a scientist. I am a person who, like everyone else in the world, is trying to stay safe from the coronavirus. And I live as an African-American in this society. And so I can't help but look at these three challenges and see similarities in terms of our exposure to these three things, our sensitivity to them, and then our ability to adapt or be resilient to them. And if those of you that are astute to what I just did, I just gave the framework for vulnerability, because when you look at the IPCC's reports and dig deep into them, they talk about vulnerability, and vulnerability is exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And so today, I'm sure we'll get into a conversation, because I just saw a report from the WMO just out on the number of extreme weather events, increasing billion-dollar weather events around the world Florida is certainly vulnerable given the hurricane and sea level rise, but also heat waves, fires, and flooding as well. So this is a conversation we need to have, and we need to have it because frankly, they're not disconnected. When I talk about climate change and vulnerability, there are certain populations, marginalized and frontline populations, that have more vulnerability than others to climate change or to the pandemic. So I look forward to the discussion.
No, Marshall, indeed. As a matter of fact, just in the last 4 days, Florida International's study on the vulnerability of housing here in South Florida in the face of a major hurricane was a big eye-opener, I think, for many, because it shows that 1 million people could be left homeless should we get, for example, had Irma followed the path that originally was slated for her to do right through the heart of the metro here in South Florida in 2017. You know, out of those 1 million people, a lot of those folks are definitely, you know, vulnerable frontline communities. Just recently, as a matter of fact, I've been reporting about the proposed rollback of NEPA, and how that would set us back to the days when, for example, the community of Overtown here in South Florida was bulldozed to insert Interstate 95 and what that meant for Overtown. I've been reporting on heat, increasing heat here in Miami, which, by the way, the ratio of hot temperatures to cold temperature records this year in South Florida is 188 to 2.
Wow.
Hot temperature records to cold temperature records if you take Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and Key West combined. So how do frontline communities, which the majority of folks here in South Florida, you know, are financially challenged, make decisions when they're facing this increased heat and they can't, you know, they struggle to decide to whether to turn on the air conditioner or not, given that it's hardly affordable, right, to pay for their electricity. So there's many, many intersecting factors here indeed. Now, over the last year, Marshall, I think we've seen an illustration that the inequities, you know, are becoming more elevated, and you know, things that a lot of people didn't see in the past, which were always there, of course, but are now becoming more evident to all. Not just to the people that are living through it, but to everybody in society. Now, in the book you recently published, titled The Race Awakening of 2020, a 6-step guide for moving forward, you call the pandemic-stressed spring and summer a, quote, historical inflection point on race. Now, at the same time, you know, we're seeing hurricanes ramping up in intensity, these rapid intensification cycles happening with greater frequency. We're seeing a greater proportion of cyclones around the world reaching category 3, 4, and 5. The west of the US has been ravaged by unprecedented fires. And now, you know, these events are disproportionately impacting those with low income, as well as Black and brown communities. Now, these challenges don't exist in vacuums, and solutions cannot be advanced in silos. What are your thoughts on how those who work on climate change can do better to think about solutions holistically, building resilience and justice for all within our communities?
Thank you for that question, John. The first thing we have to do as a community of scientists and scholars and ivory tower folks is get over ourselves as ivory tower folks. I think we do a poor job, not John Morales, of course, and I'd like to think that I do as well, but the climate change discussion is so far removed for many people that they think it is just about polar bears or butterflies or the year 2080. I come from a low to middle income family community in Georgia, Canton, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. And when I go home, the people there don't care about carbon dioxide trend lines and model sensitivity and the like. They're thinking about their grocery bill and their electric bill and how they're going to make their next healthcare payment. But what I do is I try to make the dots connect for them to say your kitchen table issues that I just mentioned are all related to climate change, because people don't understand and I don't blame them when they're living life, particularly in pandemic and facing racism and other things, that the price of the cereal they buy for their kids, or their healthcare costs, or the bridge that they're driving on, or other related issues that they deal with every day have direct links to this climate change thing that they hear us talking about all the time. So I wrote an article in Forbes a couple of years ago called 9 Tips for Communicating Science to Non-Scientists. And I would invite everyone on the call to take a look at that at some point, because the first hurdle to answer your question is just improving how we talk about it, making it relevant. I have a pastor at a church that I used to go to that used to say, you got to make it plain. And so you got to make it plain for people. Secondly, the ivory tower folks like that I deal with, we have the knowledge, and you have the knowledge, John, as a scientist as well. But a lot of times people frown upon the notion of talking to the media or going before policymakers. And if we're not there, there are people with disingenuous motives that spread denialism and contrarianism that are happy to fill the gap that we leave behind. So we have to be on the playing field in order to catch the ball. And this ball is very important. It's the ball that is the fabric of life, because we don't have a plan B planet. We don't have another option. And we've got options for vaccines for pandemic. We've got, hopefully within the next year, going to have several options. We don't have a plan B. We can't live on Mars right now, or Venus. And so we have to worry about this planet, and the very people that are most vulnerable to climate change are the ones least likely to be contributing to it in terms of the carbon footprints, not only here in the US, but around the world. And so, just one last point about your question, climate, because I get this a lot. What do we have to do in terms of resiliency? One, we know that mitigation is the big picture strategy. We've got to reduce greenhouse emissions and so forth, whether that be through carbon taxes, changing our diets to more plant-based diets, family planning, all the things that we actually talk about on a project I'm involved with in Georgia called Drawdown Georgia, which is a part of a larger Project Drawdown effort. But in the meantime, we have to also think about adaptive capacity or adaptation programs. I know in South Florida, you're dealing with sea level and sunny day flooding and saltwater intrusion into your drinking water, for example, and infrastructure vulnerabilities because of hurricanes. So we have to have a multi-pronged strategy, but the biggest picture strategy is that we have to have transformational solutions, not incremental. We can all buy, electric cars or change our light bulbs and change our diet, but we still need climate policy that matters, international policy that matters. So the best thing that we can do is to be climate focused and climate focused voters.
Indeed, and I'll emphasize voters, that being so important. And then, not just voting, you have to demand action from the leaders that we have, in charge. Right. Whoever this new round of people that might come in, after November 3rd and in January, well, we need to take immediate and urgent action in many, many aspects. And it's not just the power of the vote, it's also the power of your voice, whether it's phone calls to your senators or Congress people or state senators and representatives, that all is important as well. Now, for many people, the TV meteorologist, Marshall, is the only scientist someone in the public encounters on a daily basis, right? I have the privilege of coming into people's living rooms every afternoon and evening. Now, you've said that our scientist colleagues on TV and, for example, the National Weather Service office are, quote, not simply practitioners, they are scientists serving society, and that we scientists need to engage beyond the lab or ivory tower, as you just mentioned in your previous answer. Policymakers, stakeholders, and the public need our presence and expertise more than ever, end quote. Now, how do we scientists work more collaboratively with the governments and the communities impacted first and worst by climate change to help them understand the risks and make informed decisions?
That's a great question. And before I forget it, you've mentioned the book that I wrote. I just wanted, before we run out of time, it is available on Amazon, and it's Amazon Prime Day for those of you that have Amazon. I've been on there spending money all day today on electronics. That's my little hobby. But The Race Awakening of 2020, the 6-step guide for moving forward, is available on Amazon for those that were curious about it. It's a pretty quick and cheap read. But to answer your question, Um, there are strategies that we need to do. One thing we need to do is we need to be a part of the communities and understand their perspective. I spent a good deal of my career at NASA, for example. I want to give a little example to kind of set up the point I'm trying to make. I was a scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center for 12 years before coming to the University of Georgia. And we had an applied sciences division that was trying to take all of this really cool NASA satellite data and model data and downscale it to communities, water managers, transportation managers, health officials. And it was like, we've got all this really great stuff here. Here's the problem though. We weren't asking those communities what they needed, what formats they needed, what were their concerns. And I think that's a big challenge in our science today. We kind of push our perspective onto the communities rather than being immersive with the communities to understand their needs. You go into Overtown or you go into Southwest Atlanta and understand, what are you facing? Are you facing street flooding? What are the issues that you see? Don't even bring up carbon dioxide or climate change. Just talk about establish a relationship with people and stakeholders, understand the values that are important to them. And then once you build those relationships and establish a value proposition that can work, then you can start to develop solutions at the local to regional, perhaps, and larger scale. So that's one. And Catherine Hayhoe, who I'm going to be speaking with, I'm going to be talking to the National Fair Housing Alliance actually in a couple of hours after this speaking engagement. Catherine and I are on the bill together. Catherine often talks about establishing and connecting on value systems, and that way then you can develop plans of action. I wholeheartedly agree with that, but I would take it a step further. Immersive activities, like I know ISC and others are doing, are very important, because I will tell you, as someone that has been in some of these frontline communities, oftentimes they experience sort of the great savior fatigue. We academics come into their communities and study them for 3 and 4 years and then leave. We've got to have a sustained relationship and understand what matters to them.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's about meeting people where they are, right?
Yes.
And that opens up the conversation. That you know your audience, you know, you need to be able to connect.
Yes.
And you know, throwing a textbook worth of information through a fire hose at them is just not going to be a way to collaboratively find solutions going
John,
forward.
can I say one more thing, because you're key to this, because you opened up that question by talking about the importance of the broadcast meteorologist. And as you and I both know, for some time, there was a lot of skepticism and climate skepticism among colleagues of ours. That has shifted. I've seen the numbers. And that's so important because, as you mentioned, the average person in South Florida is not thumbing through the peer review literature or listening to seminars by an academic at the University of Miami or the University of Georgia, but they are watching John Morales every night. And I love that you interject and include climate science within your broadcast and within your messaging, because yes, while we're told to stick to weather or don't talk about this or that, we both know that they're related. So that's actually a quite silly mandate that but we get it on Twitter all the time. By the way, if you're on Twitter, please follow. I know John's on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Shepherd, DrShepHerd 2013. John and I both keep it quite interesting on Twitter, and we'd love to have you as our followers.
Yeah, Marshall's a terrific follow, as a matter of fact, on Twitter. I highly recommend them. All right, so I reported on this a few months ago. We were already into the pandemic. This report that aired on NBC6 got quite a bit of traction, particularly on social media platforms, about disinformation and science denialism. And through this pandemic, Marshall, I mean, we certainly had our share of denialism, misinformation that's plagued also and spilled over into the topic of climate change. Actually, of course, we've been living with that for decades, as a matter of fact. Now, information and warnings from epidemiologists, just like the information from climate scientists, has been sidelined, ignored. Now, you've written about this psychological effect called motivated reasoning, right? The idea is that people have a tendency to arrive at conclusions that they desire to arrive at, even if the evidence shows otherwise. Now, in the case of both the coronavirus and climate change, the result is, of course, failing to mobilize a rapid response to the threat, and the consequences of this delay, just like we've seen in the US during the pandemic, are dire, and people are dying in the case of the pandemic, and people are dying in the case of climate change too. What are your thoughts on practical ways that we can cut through this challenge? What can we do about it?
Yeah, so I just saw the new Yale Climate Communication 6 America study. If you're not familiar with that, I would advise you to Google it. They sample the US every year to see where the American population is on climate change. And the good news is the last category is something called the dismissive, those that are just absolutely dismissive. That continues to shrink. It's about 7% of the US population. A lot of times people on Twitter or at Thanksgiving dinner with that uncle that watches certain media, listens to certain media, they're the loud ones. They're the ones that are shouting all this stuff at you, but it's typically not correct. But you, in part of the strategy, you can't spend your time on the dismissive because you're going to be spinning your wheels. You've got to focus on those that are cautious or disengaged, but perhaps willing to listen. Again, the things that I talk about in general are making the messages clear and plain to people and their value systems, understanding that policy decisions at the state, local level, and so forth are going to very much have climate tied up in them. If you notice the last two presidential debates, climate change has been a significant part of them, and that's landmark in itself. That's a landmark accomplishment because it barely got mentions in previous election cycles. So I think we are speaking of inflection points earlier, I think we are approaching, I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're approaching an inflection point on climate within our society where people clearly see that something is going on. These rapidly intensifying hurricanes, for example, off the coast of the Gulf Coast in Florida with Michael, or these stalled storms like we saw with Dorian a couple of years. I think people see what's going on with the fires and heat waves and so forth. But now we have to sort of connect the dots in a more sort of meaningful way than this sort of broad esoteric thing. And that's why I have been focusing, John, on the psychology aspects. You mentioned motivated reasoning, because we see it all the time. We see it here in Atlanta whenever snow is in the forecast. The meteorologist might say 3 to 6 inches of snow, but because people want snow so badly here in Georgia, they'll just hear the 6. But then when there's only 3, they say the meteorologist wasn't correct. No, they were correct. They said 3 to 6, but you heard what you wanted to hear. And so we see that in science with things like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people think they know more than they do, or confirmation bias, consuming information from places that already support what they already believe, or even optimism bias. Optimism bias is this notion that, I've survived 6 hurricanes in 30 years. I can survive the next one. Well, no, the next one may be an anomaly. We're in a new normal. So your past experiences aren't a good reference point. And we see that with things like climate change and coronavirus too. And so I think once people understand the messaging, then they understand the relevance to themselves, but then they understand their own biases about how they think about some of these topics. And we have to sort of point that out. I think we can make progress. I have a TED talk on 3 biases that shape people's perceptions on science. And I talk about this that's his, David, our good friend, Greg Fishel, that you and I both know. I include a snippet in that TED talk because he talks about how he had confirmation bias as a skeptic until he looked at what was going on and understood that he was actually exhibiting that. So it's important that people understand their own biases about this as well, and then we can move forward.
So Marshall, we're going to pivot now to some questions from the audience. These have been relayed to me, and I'll start with this one. What recommendations do you have for Southeast Florida specifically, for our community leaders, to make sure that local and regional climate adaptation strategies do not worsen the existing social injustices? For example, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is, they have this Back Bay project you may have heard about, and it's a cost-benefit analysis in terms of what areas of the city are going to be protected and which areas may not. So, is there and they, by the way, they say they're using the CDC's vulnerability index to make these determinations. So it's not like they're just looking at cost benefit, they're looking at vulnerability index. But there is some concern down here that once again, there's going to be environmental and climate injustices should this project go forward. So what recommendations do you have for our local leaders to avoid that?
Yeah, and I don't know the specific issues going on in Florida, although I am familiar with that particular one. And I was going to mention, because environmental justices and climate justices always rear their head. And a lot of times I think they rear their heads, and in some cases I think they are intentional, but in some cases they're not intentional. They're kind of like big microaggressions. If anyone knows what a microaggression is, you're like, oh, you really are an articulate, or credit to your race, Dr. Shepard. That's a microaggression. That's not a compliment, by the way. Why? But my point in that is I think there are things that people are well-intentioned, even with these sort of adaptation projects, but they have deleterious effects. And so I think that it goes back to what I talked about earlier, which is immersing the communities in the process from the incipient stages. And are those affected communities, those affected civic organizations, Chamber of Commerce, so forth, they need to be at the table, not midway through or in the back end, but at the beginning stages. Also, I've talked a bit about this before, and not in writing, but in some previous speeches that I've given. When we start to do these large adaptation projects or economic development projects, there are certain codes that have to be met. I believe that we need an environmental justice set of codes or standards that builders and developers and policymakers need to check off in the same way they check off zoning codes and so forth, and make sure that these environmental justice indicators are being met as well. So these are things that I've talked about, because it can happen. I mean, for example, here in Atlanta, I've got a colleague in my department at the University of Georgia that has talked about, the interesting sort of move back into the city, the sort of gentrification and things that are going on, and the interesting environmental injustices around even that. I mean, as people that are able to do so, buy $500, $600 million, $100,000 million condos in Atlanta, because they're trying to shorten their commute. That's good for the environment and climate, because you're lowering your carbon footprint, but it then creates economic and environmental injustices, because people that used to live in a city, people like my wife's family, by the way, who are from the heart of Atlanta and now have to move out, and then they're reverse commuting and their carbon footprints are going up. So there are some really interesting things that I think in some cases are intentional, and in some cases that are not intentional, that just need to be thought about on the front end.
Yeah, and I mean, here in South Florida, we face similar situations in rural Haiti and some of the communities that are on higher ground, right?
Yeah.
Coastal.
I've read about some of that higher ground issue there in Miami.
So here's a follow-up to your question to your answer rather on recommendations to local leaders. Somebody is saying, I totally agree with establishing relationships with communities. Unfortunately, many municipal teams don't have the bandwidth to be in the community as much as we want. Do you have any suggestions?
Great point, because we are bandwidth limited. And so, I'm a firm believer in establishing community cores or community liaison programs, because one of the things that I've found, John, and I suspect you have too, is when here in Atlanta and in Georgia, there are so many community, I won't say activists, but that's probably what they are, that are engaged. They know what's going on in their watershed. They know what's going on with their air quality. And so it would be interesting if local municipalities established formal, environmental or climate liaison advisory groups or cores, like, we have AmeriCorps we have the Peace Corps. These are federal programs. Let's try some of these very successful efforts at the state and local level.
We don't have a lot of time left, but it's interesting because sometimes there are very good intentions from local political leaders who will install say a resiliency officer for their particular municipality, but then a change of administration, new mayor comes in, They don't care about resiliency. They don't necessarily care that much about the subject of climate. And, you know, that's the end of that position. And, and in the state of Florida, by the way, we had a chief resiliency officer
Oh, I know. Yeah.
installed. 6 months later, she took a job in the Trump administration, and that's fine and dandy. But the problem is she has not been replaced, and many months have passed.
Exactly. So in the state of Georgia, and I imagine Florida has a public service commission as well. We have a public service commission that thinks about energy related issues. It'd be interesting to have an environmental services commission of some sort, you know, that is sort of sustainable through transition periods like you talked about.
Okay, well, we only have a couple of minutes left, Marshall, and so this we're going to answer very briefly, and I'll start it. It's a question about the connection between climate change and intensifying tropical cyclones around the planet. You know, we've seen that happen in the Atlantic Basin. Hurricanes are forming where they didn't used to form. Strong hurricanes are where they didn't used to be at. Just in recent years, right? I mean, I can think of Ophelia and was it Pablo? I mean, all these different storms. So folks are asking for a very brief, try to keep it to 45-second synopsis of the connection between climate and intensifying tropical cyclones.
Sure, and I just recently wrote on this in Forbes in the last week. So here's the synopsis in 30 seconds or less. We don't have evidence that we're going to see more hurricanes. So get out this notion that we're going to have more hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin. But when we do, on average, they're going to be stronger. What we also know is that they seem to be intensifying more rapidly, rapid intensification, slowing down or stalling, and are wetter. In other words, because they're stalling or slowing down, they produce more flooding rain, Hurricane Harveys and Florences of the world. So there's no evidence of more hurricanes, but when they do form, they're going to be stronger. So that's why I thought the comment by Vice President Pence was a bit disingenuous in his debate by saying there have not been more hurricanes in the last 100 years. Scientists have known that for decades. We're not going to see more of them, but they're going to be stronger when we have them.
Yeah, conveniently, he didn't mention the part about stronger, right?
Right.
Which we are seeing. And by the way, I mean, to close that synopsis out, basically we're changing the speed limit of how strong hurricanes can get because the physics of the atmosphere is changing. The ocean atmosphere interaction, warmer water, feeding hurricanes and leading therefore to higher wind speeds like we are seeing right now.
Basic physics, John. Hurricanes are running on 93 octane fuel, not 87 these days.
That's right. That's right. And thankfully lead-free. All right. So my time is up. Our time is up. This was terrific, Marshall. Thank you very much for this conversation to kick off the summit. And now back to the organizers.
Thanks.
Thank you, John and Dr. Shepard. We're grateful to you both for an amazing conversation and wonderful insights. You're both incredible communicators, enabling that interface between what's known in the academy and what's known in the living room. And we're grateful to both of you for your work and for taking the time to join us today.